Hello and welcome to this video on the demand for labour. In this video we're going to look at the factors that influence the demand for labour, what is meant by the term derived demand, and what will influence the elasticity of demand for labour. So let's start off. The demand for labour shows how many workers an employer is willing and able to hire at a given wage rate in a given time period. Let's make sure we have this definition down. Now, here we have the amount of workers and a wage rate. So effectively, we have price and quantity. In this market, the wage rate is the price, so that's the price of a worker per hour, and the level of employment is like our quantity. And we can see here the demand curve for labour. And we can see that there is an inverse relationship between demand for labour and the wage rate. If the wage rate is high, then it's more costly to hire employees, and we have a relatively low level of employment at E2. When wages are lower, labour becomes relatively cheaper than capital, than machinery, so businesses may substitute their machinery for workers. So for example, at wage rate 3, we have a much higher demand for labour of E3. Now, labour is what we would describe as being a derived demand, or having a derived demand. And what do we mean by this? A derived demand is the demand for a factor of production used to produce another good or service. So we don't necessarily want workers just for the sake of it. We want them because we use them, we demand that factor of production, we use them to produce another good or service. So for example, steel would be another factor of production that has a derived demand. The demand for steel is not because we just want sheets of steel lying around, it's because we want to use the steel to make cars and new buildings and things like that. So the demand for steel is derived from the construction of new buildings and cars. Likewise, the demand for labour is derived from the demand for the outputs of the goods and services that labour produces. So when the economy is growing strongly, many businesses will look to hire extra workers to supply increased output. During a recession or an economic slowdown, the demand for labour will tend to fall. So let's make sure we have derived demand, and in particular with reference to labour, down in our notes, and then we'll move on. Now, if we have a demand curve for labour, the relationship between the wage rate and the amount of employment that businesses want to do, then that can be either elastic or inelastic. If the demand curve for labour is elastic, what we're saying is that employment levels are very sensitive to a change in wages. So if the wage rate rises from W1 to W2, we see a big fall in the level of employment. On the flip side, if the demand curve for labour is inelastic, what we're saying is a large rise or change in wages won't cause much difference in the level of employment. So here in our example, we can see that a big change in wage rate from W1 to W2 has only caused a small change in the demand for workers. So what would influence the elasticity of demand? Well, the elasticity of labour demand measures the responsiveness of demand when there is a change in the wage rate. So let's make sure that we have this down first of all. And it depends on a number of factors. First of all, the labour costs as a percentage of total costs. When labour expenses are quite a high percentage of total costs, labour demand is more wage elastic, more sensitive to changes in wage. How easily can we substitute workers for machines? If we can easily substitute them, then we're likely to be more wage elastic. If we can't, then it's going to be more wage inelastic. What about the price elasticity of demand for the final product? If the demand for the final product is price inelastic, then the higher costs can be passed on, and so demand for labour is likely to be more inelastic. And lastly, what's the time period? In the long run, it's easier to switch away from workers to machines, so that would make demand more elastic. In the short run, the demand for labour tends to be more wage inelastic. So the demand curve for labour can also shift, and it can shift to the left, a decrease in demand, or shift to the right, an increase in demand. And these are factors that would cause a shift. So if there was a rise in final consumer demand, for the products that are being made. This means the business has to take on more workers and would shift the demand for labour to the right. If there was a change in the market price of the output that the labour is making, if there was a fall in price of cars, then there'd be an increased demand for car workers. An increase in the productivity of labour, which maybe made labour more cost efficient, would increase the demand for workers. A government employment subsidy would increase the demand for workers. And perhaps a change in the cost of capital equipment, and here that's a substitute, would influence the demand for workers. So if there's more robotic technology that was cheaper, that would reduce the demand for workers. Having said all that, we must remember that shifts in labour demand are caused by factors other than the wage rate. A change in the wage rate results in a movement along the curve. So in this video, we've looked at factors that influence the demand for labour, what is meant by derived demand, and the elasticity of demand for labour. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.